So let's have a look at the marsh tit. Ken is going to present the results. He spent almost 30 years working for the RSPB and their science team, particularly on species and habitats, and he's really well known for his work on woodland birds. He's also on our scientific subcommittee, and last year Ken and Linda organised a sample survey of marsh tits, which many of you took part in, for which thanks, and today he'll reveal whether this red-listed bird is actually as scarce as we think. Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Smith.
Well, thank you, Keith. Can everybody hear okay? I don't need the other mic. Brilliant. I'm doing the speaking this morning, but Linda and I do a lot of this stuff together, I'm pleased to say, and we don't argue all that much, which is quite amazing when things get difficult. I'm a new kid on the block when it comes to Hampshire. We only moved down this way 6 or 7 years ago, and I've been involved in HOS ever since. But one thing I've come to realise is that Hampshire is an incredibly special place for bird populations and other habitats. There are so many species now for which Hampshire holds nationally important populations. And I hope to convince you in the next 10 minutes that we should add marsh tit to this list. But it turns out that Hampshire has really big numbers. Okay. So the marsh tit is red-listed nationally, and it's red-listed because of declining populations. On this slide, we've got the BTO population trend graph. Lizzie put some similar things up earlier for the wader species. This is for the marsh tit from the 60s through to now, showing big declines. And it's about an 80% decline since the 60s to now, and somewhere around 50% in the more recent couple of decades. There's also been a bit of a range contraction. This is the BTO breeding atlas, and those red dots are each 10 kilometre squares. And the marsh tit currently is in about 1,000 10 kilometre squares. But there's been a smaller decline in range. And if you look at the map in the bottom corner there, you can see the black symbols represent the squares where the marsh tit have been lost. And they're kind of round the edges, and quite a big element up north, certainly some of those northern counties. But really, in Sussex and places along the coast that they've gone. But also note that it is still in about 1,000 1 kilometre square, so it's still quite a widespread species. And in Hampshire, it certainly is widespread. So these two maps were copied from the excellent Hampshire Atlas, and you can see the distribution. So it's in around 500 tetrads in the county. That marsh tit in the corner is looking where to go and find a mate. You could go all over the place in Hampshire. There's lots of marsh tits. The interesting thing I find in those maps is it was actually recorded in more tetrads in winter than it was in the breeding season. And I think that's quite significant. I think that's something to do with the difficulty of surveying marsh tits. So anyway, with this background, we decided that HOS really ought to get to grips with the marsh tit and try and establish some baseline figures and work out the population. And so we did a survey in 2023, and the survey was based on a random selection of monads, 1 kilometre squares. You can see that it would be impossible to count all the marsh tits in Hampshire, not a chance of doing that. So we had to select some, and I make no apologies for doing this, but we selected squares at random. So bird watchers sometimes get a bit upset about this, but it's the only way that you can actually collect data that you can extrapolate up to the full population. And we used a playback method, and this was developed initially by the RSPB. In fact, I was involved in developing it for willow tit census. And it turns out that both marsh tit and willow tit respond readily to playback. And this isn't some massive big amplifier beaming all over the place. You just use your phone, so you just get your phone out. You've got the marsh tit call on there, and you try and arrange that it's audible from 100 metres or so. So you're not interested in attracting birds, you're just getting the birds in their territories to respond, and you do that every 200 metres, and you do 2 visits. Important point here is the visits have to be between mid-Feb and March, end of March, early April. So the Marsh Tit Survey season is already over, guys. And this is common for a lot of woodland birds. And I think this is one of the factors that makes them rather hard to monitor, that actually most of the breeding season monitoring is too late to pick them up. So marsh tits will have already got their territories and partners sorted and will go quiet, just like lesser spotted woodpeckers. On the side there, you've got a couple of recording forms. I didn't say who they were done by, but at least one person in the audience will recognise those sheets as theirs. And essentially, you walked around your 1 kilometre square trying to go through all the bits of woodland, playing the record every 200 metres and counting how many birds you got. So we had to work out how to select these 1 kilometre squares, and luckily the Hampshire Biodiversity Information Centre could provide the figures for the area of broadleaf and mixed woodland, which we thought was the habitat for marsh tit, in each 1k square, and so we could then sample those. And we divided it into 3 strata. I think we made a slight error in this, but I'll tell you about it in a minute. But we had 3 levels, 15 to 30%, 30 to 60, and a greater 60% cover. And the map on the left there is the map from the website. We created a website for this, like we're doing commonly for HOS surveys now. And green dots are squares that were surveyed, and red ones, when this map was produced, hadn't been allocated. But we ended up with around 100 squares. Okay, the results. Well, we got data back from 107 squares, so that means 100 or so volunteers took part in the survey, which was brilliant. And just to show how common the marsh tit was, that we had 482 territories in there. So actually this is a great survey. It's very satisfying for everybody to do because most people actually got something out of it. I think there were only about 6 squares where no marsh tits were recorded. So the playback method and the marsh tits still being relatively common means that everybody got a buzz out of doing this thing. And on average, we had about 4.8 territories per 1k square, and that translated into about 9 per 100 hectares of woodland, square kilometre of woodland. So a really good density of marsh tits. If you just work out the area of broadleaf mixed woodland in Hampshire and multiply it by that figure, you come up with a population estimate of around 5,000 or 6,000. If you do the sums in a more complicated way with all the different strata that I described, you get a similar thing of about 5,300 tetrads with a confidence range. So that allows for the noise in the data, that it's not perfect, quite wide, between 2,900 and 8,000 territories, but that's a realistic confidence range. I said earlier that we made a little mistake. I think we should have surveyed more squares with very low woodland cover, because when you look at the records submitted to HOS in that year, quite a few of the marsh tits are actually found in squares that don't have all that much woodland. And so we estimate that probably about 1,000 territories are in those. So that gives us a final figure of 6,300 territories. Just a few things that have come out of the data. You can plot the number of territories versus the area of woodland in the square. And I've done this for the New Forest and the rest of Hampshire separately. So the red symbols are the New Forest, and the rest of Hampshire are the black symbols. And you can, well, first thing you can see is the more woodland, the more marsh tits. So that's kind of the blindingly obvious, really. It'd be a bit disappointing if that didn't come out. So squares with more woodland in have more marsh tit territories, that's fine. But there's also quite a big effect of more marsh tits being found in New Forest squares than the rest of Hampshire, which is interesting. I suspect it's a habitat thing in the forest that makes it that bit special. These lines and all the rest of it are highly significant statistically, so it really is a valid conclusion. The other question is, well, what's actually the trend in marsh tits in Hampshire? So there's obviously now quite a lot. And I've looked at the data available on this, and if you look at the change map in the Hampshire Atlas, there was about a 20% decline in the number of occupied tetrads in the last 20 years, implying a decline. So I think there probably was some decline. What I've also been able to do, thanks to Glyn and George, is to use the BTO data from the Breeding Bird Survey to see what proportion of the randomly selected 1 kilometre squares in the BBS had marsh tits. So the BBS only started in 1994, when there were about 30 squares covered in Hampshire, but that's now increased to about 150 done each year. That's now a really good sample to do something with. And so the top graph in the middle there is the proportion of those BBS squares that had marsh tit records. And that is about 10% of any random square in Hampshire will have marsh tits recorded in it. And there's no change in that whatsoever. It's a bit odd in the early years where it seemed to be lower, but I think that's probably an artifact of the initial setup of the BBS and how the squares got self-selected in the early years. But even with that included in the data, there's no trend in that at all. So as far as BBS is concerned, marsh tit is doing okay in Hampshire. And the bottom graph there in the middle is actually the number of marsh tits recorded in each of those positive BBS squares, and that is stuck at about 2. Now the BBS is done in April and May, which is not a good time for picking up marsh tits, but the fact that some are found in the squares later on in the season suggests actually there's probably more breeding, but they wouldn't pick up. And the last box on the right there is surveys that, in fact, I had a hand in both those in a New Forest where RSPB had paid field teams doing point count surveys of breeding birds, and we did that in 1985, and it was repeated in 2003, 2004. And in 85, nearly 500 points were counted, and the average marsh tit count per point was 0.28, and half those points were repeated 20 years later, and the average was 0.33. There's no change there, really. They're similar numbers. So I suspect marsh tit may be going down a bit in some bits of Hampshire, but it seems to be doing well in most of it. Just a word about the context of all this. So the Hampshire population we got down as over 6,000. I was involved in a survey using the same methods in Sussex, which was in 2019 to 21 with COVID year in the middle. And the Sussex estimate was 7,800 using similar things. So both Hampshire and Sussex seem to have really good populations of marsh tits. The current national population estimate from the Avian Population Estimate Panel is 28,500 territories. Now, on face value, that means Sussex and Hampshire hold about half the UK population. I don't think that's true. I think they do hold a very high fraction of the population, but a lot less than that. I think it means actually the national population estimate is probably too low, and more counties need to do what Hampshire have done and do a proper survey. The methods are available, very applicable. I think what's going on with marsh tits is it's a landscape effect, and counties with good levels of woodland cover, high woodland cover, are probably hanging on to their birds. If you talk to Rich Broughton, who's doing work on them in East Anglia, his birds have perfectly good breeding success and all the young disappear. And I think what's going on in some of those landscapes is the normal pattern of dispersal is really poor for them, and you end up losing the young birds each year. Whereas in well-wooded areas like Hampshire, you've got this whole population structure that seems to function. So that's it. I think it's been a fantastic survey. Thank you. Oh, hang on, I've got a thanks slide. Thank you for all the field workers who done the work. Thank you for all the BBS workers. Thank you to the Record Centre for providing the woodland stuff. I think this will be published in the Hampshire Bird Report. It's already written up and waiting to go. It's been a fantastic survey. Thank you.